I would like to start off this video with an apology because my last video, Avocado Hand, was vertical, and I had 4 different people send me this Muppet PSA about how awful vertical videos are, so I'm sorry. I have learned my lesson and it will not happen again. So I was actually going to make this video anyways, and then I actually got a request from someone to talk about this. So if you have seen the news in the last 18 hours, you might be aware of a case up in Vancouver, Canada, where this young girl was dragged into the water by a seal. If you watch the video, it starts off with the seal swimming in this pier. Someone holds out their hand like this as if they have food, and the seal comes closer. Initially, this young girl, she's about 8 years old, she was standing on the edge of the pier, and the seal rose out of the water, looked at her, and it was this like majestic moment. The seal went back to the water. I'm guessing the little girl decided to take a photo with him, so she turned around, she had her back to the water, she sat down, and the seal jumped up, grabbed her, dragged her into the water, and an older gentleman, I'm guessing was her grandfather, jumped in to save her. Now luckily this little girl wasn't injured, but she was obviously very shocked by this incident, which is perfectly natural. One explanation I have heard animal experts say is that her white dress actually made the seal think that she was food in and of herself. And when I was doing some research, I found another case where there was a gentleman down in San Diego who had been fishing. He caught something and was holding it over the edge of his boat to take a photo, I think. And a seal jumped up out of the water, grabbed him by the hand, dragged him 20 feet under the water, and he did actually require stitches. Seals are not naturally aggressive towards humans, but they do get closer and closer to humans as they get fed by humans. And this is something I view in general as a serious concern, and that is people feeding wildlife. Partially because you never actually know how wildlife will respond. So another story I have for this is in regards to a very tragic case that happened in the summer of 2016. And that was this young 2-year-old boy was at Walt Disney World with his family. They were at the Polynesian Resort and they were wading through the lagoon out front when an alligator grabbed the little boy, dragged him underwater, and the little boy did not survive. I actually used to work at Walt Disney World, and I knew people that were actually working at the Polynesian at the time that this happened. I knew someone who was a first responder, and I can't even imagine how horrific this scenario was. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in any way involved in this. But afterwards, when I was doing some research and talking to people who I knew that were at the Polynesian, one thing I found out, which wasn't really reported on in the news, or at least not that I saw, was the fact that there is a set of bungalows now in front of the Polynesian in the lagoon that Disney recently opened, or had recently opened prior to this incident, and it had been observed that people staying there were throwing bits of food off of the balcony into the water, and as a result, alligators were becoming far more comfortable coming closer to the shore. Now, there were signs up saying no swimming, and I'll be perfectly honest, when I was at Walt Disney World, I hung out at the resorts a lot. Every time I was there, I usually saw people just wading through the water. I never thought anything of it. The reason why I thought the no swimming signs were there was due to the fact that very close by is where you can rent watercraft such as a boat, or I think they only have boats there. And I thought that Disney wanted people to stay out of the area where boats might be, so they were fine with people just dipping their feet in, but they didn't want them actually swimming and getting in the way of these motorized watercraft. I never thought that anything like this could happen. And to be honest, the main thing I do blame in this scenario is the fact that people had been feeding these alligators and making the alligators far more comfortable with people in the water as a result of that. in general, I just think feeding wildlife is not a good idea. It's not a good idea for both humans and for the animals. So think about it this way. If you're at a park and animals have learned that if they hang out by the benches, there's a good chance there'll be food, you could be creating competition because different types of animals might be hanging out there in the chances of getting scraps. You're creating a scarcity. Now, I have both a cat and a dog, and one thing I've noticed is if I'm eating, both of my animals sometimes like to come up close to me to try to get scraps, and the cat gets extremely territorial and will swat away the dog. Many different types of animals are extremely territorial, but it's pretty different if it's a 12-pound dog, or a 12-pound cat and a 70-pound dog versus a raccoon and a chipmunk. And I've actually seen animal experts say that this has led to increased fighting and animals being injured or even killed by each other. I personally do not feel super comfortable if I'm out in the wild and an animal comes up close to me, because wild animals are extremely hard to predict what their behavior will be. So someone else might be perfectly comfortable with even a squirrel coming up to them. I'm personally not. And actually one time when I was graduating high school, I was walking around a college campus with my parents that I had been interested in attending. This was a college that was very well known for being sort of hippie and liberal. And while we stopped to look at a map, a squirrel came up and sat on my mom's foot. And we were all terrified that if we tried to shoo away the squirrel with our hand, there was a good chance that the squirrel could bite us. And we found out that the squirrels were not at all afraid of humans due to the fact that so many people had been feeding them. Feeding animals out in the wild can also lead to a greater chance of disease being spread. So think of this in terms of deer. They can have ticks on them which carry Lyme, or there is a possibility that ticks carry Lyme disease, and that can be a very devastating illness for humans. Avril Lavigne actually was diagnosed with Lyme disease. So there's that. You also might be doing far more harm to animals than you mean, and I really don't think that most people that feed animals have any ill intentions. I think most people honestly do it because they want to get a cool photo with an animal, or possibly just to have an emotional connection with nature, which I understand why someone would want that. But there is a possibility when you're feeding an animal, you're giving them something that is toxic to them or could malnourish them. So, for instance, there is something called angel wing, which occurs when ducks and geese are fed too much white bread, and it's a devastating deformity for these birds. You also could be teaching these animals become dependent on humans, and they might be less inclined to do natural things such as hunting or gathering food to feed themselves, because they come to expect that there is a far easier food source for them to get. And if possibly you live in a state where they have very harsh winters and people don't like to go out as much during the winters, you could actually be causing the animals to starve as a result of this. So these are just some of my thoughts. I understand why some people are more inclined to feed wildlife, and if you absolutely must feed like a squirrel, a better alternative to feeding a squirrel straight from your hand is to put in a squirrel feeder and just place it outside of your window so you can watch it. If you're like my mom and you really want to take care of feral cats, one thing that you can do is feed feral cats and then catch them to be spayed and neutered and then release them back to the wild. That's what my mom does, and it's actually really good for the environment because it helps keep the feral cat population in check. And that is, I think there's like 20 million feral cats in North America, just something absolutely absurd, and it has actually a lot of really devastating ecological effects. Adam Ruins Everything did a really great special about that. But, so these are just kind of my thoughts. Let me know if you have any experience with this, if you have any different thoughts. I had some really cool comments from my avocado hands video, so thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for watching this, and stay safe.